Hi, Tim.
This is Tim Burton. Another one of our people here. Isn't he a gas?
Tim, you've got such talent.
Moving right along.
Bye, Tim.
When I do ranking videos like this, it's basically just an excuse to review and talk about a set of movies, a series, or the work of a director, or something like that. And since Tim Burton had a huge impact on me as a child, and since I was excited for the new Beetlejuice movie, I thought it would be fun to look over and review all of his movies. It also gave me an excuse to rewatch some I hadn't seen for years. The other reason I thought that Burton might be interesting to rank is that there seems to be this general attitude that his movies have all been bad for a while, and that he hasn't made anything good for 20 or 25 years. And I don't agree with that, and I'd rank some of his more recent movies higher than other people would. So I thought that it might make for an interesting discussion about that also. I know plenty of people have ranked Burton's movies before me though, so I thought another thing that might make this interesting is if I added something that I don't think I've seen anybody do, which is to rank everything he's directed, and I mean everything. The short films, the music videos, the commercials, everything that's out there for people to see. And there's actually quite a lot of it with him, besides the feature films that most people know, so I thought that this list might have value in showing people things that they haven't heard of or seen for themselves before. There's some pretty rare stuff in here that I talk about, and a couple things that I hadn't even heard of myself before I started researching the video. So I think if you're a fan of Burton's movies, this might be interesting, or at least entertaining. Since this list is ranked from worst to best, we're going to start off with the ones that I have a problem with. But I don't want it to seem like this list is going to be all negativity. I actually like almost all of the movies that Burton has done, and in a little bit we're going to get to me defending several of his movies that I really like, even though they're mostly critically reviled. However, there are a few things he's done that will have to be at the bottom of the list, and there's a few that I don't really enjoy. Wednesday is one of those. An Addams Family movie is just one of those things that always seemed like Burton was made to direct it. And he did circle various Addams Family projects for decades, and the end result was enormously popular, so I'll explain why I rank it dead last in his filmography. It's a little difficult to decide how to rank this one, since Burton didn't actually direct all of it, and I like the parts that he contributed more than the parts that I don't think came from him. But in the end, the whole thing strove to present itself as a Tim Burton project, so I'm ranking it based on the whole first season, not just on the episodes that Burton directed or the ideas that I'm guessing or extrapolating were his contributions. My impression is that he didn't come up with the story, and he didn't write any of it, and he wasn't credited as the show's creator or showrunner. I think mostly what he was brought on to do was some design work and give it that, famous Tim Burton kind of look. They were basically using him as a brand more than as a creative entity, which bothers me in its own way too. But I think at this point he was just kind of burned out on movies after his experience on Dumbo, and he wanted something where he didn't have the burden of developing the whole project from the start, and he could just come in and do some drawings and direct a few episodes. It seems that doing this made him happy and got him interested in filmmaking enough again that he decided he wanted to make another Beetlejuice, when after Dumbo he had thought maybe he was done directing movies for good. So if he enjoyed the bits that he did do, then I'm glad for him. But the show as a whole, though, I think is incredibly misguided and just really kind of tedious to sit through. I think the whole idea of Wednesday going to some sort of special school for kids with monster powers, I think is just about the worst thing they could have come up with to do with the character. For one thing, a special school for gifted or different youngsters with special powers is, I think, basically the most tired premise you could think of right now. It's Xavier's school in X-Men, it's Hogwarts and Harry Potter, it's about 5 billion other young adult novels all ripping off Harry Potter and doing the same thing. Burton just did the exact same thing himself with Mrs. Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So doing it here is just about the laziest thing that the writers could have come up with. And not just a lazy, but a cliche to the point of being obnoxious. It just screams that they're going after this particular tween demographic in a very cynical way.
OMG, you look perfect!
When I look at you, the following emojis come to mind. Rope, shovel,
hole.
Of course, for some people it works and the show was a hit, but that doesn't make it any less obnoxious and revolting to me. The idea is already dumb in isolation, but it's even dumber when it's applied to Wednesday Addams. The fun of the Addams family is watching them interacting with normal people and not having any idea how weird and scary other people find them. You get comedy when you put them in a suburban neighborhood and watch how they interact and bump up against the expectations of everybody else around them, right? You get a little bit of social commentary when you see that through the eyes of the Addams family, normal people are the ones who seem weird. This kind of contrast is the entire thing that makes these characters fun. So why would they think that it's a good idea to put Wednesday in a school where all the other kids are also kind of weird like her, or they're monsters or supernatural characters? Well, I mean, I think the reason is that they wanted to cash in on the special school for teenagers, special powers trope, but it's a complete waste for these particular characters. What would have been more fun would have been the reverse. If Wednesday had been going to school with people like her and her family, and that was where she was before, and then she was transferred into a normal high school. The little bit of the show at the beginning that shows her in a normal high school before she gets kicked out is about the only entertaining part of the whole show. That part should have been the show if they weren't mining stupid young adult franchise cliches. So as far as I'm concerned, the whole premise is wrong. But then what they do with this premise is even worse. She's at Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, right? So now what happens? Well, it turns out that what happens is just a boring murder mystery with a predictable answer and a bunch of teen relationship drama that seems like it's from some sort of second-rate CW show. It's all just a waste and it's really difficult to sit through. But, you know, hey, that's just me. I mean, the kids loved it. It made good viral dance memes or something. So when I said I wanted to be exhaustive, that meant including everything Burton directed that I could find. So I'm including 2 short commercials that he did for Timex in 2000 and 1999. The commercials are basically short Matrix ripoffs where the characters constantly look at their Timex watches for reasons that aren't entirely clear. The first is called Kung Fu, and there's a few guys, which you might guess are doing Kung Fu in between checking their Timex watches. And the second is called Mannequin and has some sort of female assassin and Trinity cosplay running through a warehouse that's storing a bunch of mannequins for some reason, and then also checking her Timex watch while she's at it. If I had to rank the two separately, I'd say Mannequin is a little better because some of the mannequin imagery is kind of cool, I guess. But these commercials are only a minute long. There's not really much here to rank.
I actually felt quite good about, the texture on the costumes and things.
In the behind-the-scenes clips about the commercials that Timex posted, Burton says that he likes the textures of the costumes, which seems to be the only thing that he can think of that's good or interesting about the project. I mean, it was a paycheck for him, obviously. The only thing really of note as part of Burton's filmography is that he includes Lisa Marie here in a small part, as he did in most of his movies at the time, so that's another collaboration between the two of them. It might seem mean-spirited to rank these little commercials above the show Wednesday, but at least these commercials are only a minute long, so I'd rather sit through 2 minutes of this than rewatch 8 hours of Wednesday. I might have mentioned that I really disliked Wednesday. I'm ranking Planet of the Apes at the bottom of Burton's films because in a lot of ways I barely consider it to be a Tim Burton film. Burton has been pretty open almost since the movie came out that this was one of his first experiences with the studio really screwing with what he wanted to do, and that this really wasn't the movie that he wanted to make. Burton was more into a campy, retro, sci-fi vibe, and the studios wanted something more realistic and literal. I don't know why they'd hire Burton if they didn't want something whimsical or something that is in Burton's style, but studios don't understand what an artist does or why. They just know whether that artist makes money, and since his movies make money, they hired him for this movie even though he wasn't interested in making what they wanted and they weren't interested in what he wanted to make. The end result is a bland movie that pleases nobody and is for the most part just a chore to sit through. I didn't think the ending was as nonsensical as some people made it out to be. I mean, it was pretty easy to understand what was supposed to have happened. It's just that it was all kind of pointless. Since this was a remake of a movie with one of the most famous twist endings of all time, they knew people expected a twist ending. But since the twist ending in the first one is famous, they couldn't do that because it wouldn't surprise anybody. So they came up with something else, but it's just a big so what. Whereas the twist in the first one explained the premise of the whole movie and put what you had just seen into a new light, the twist in this one is just that the guy thinks he's got home safe, but actually now home has been taken over too. I mean, it's sort of sequel bait, I guess, except that in this case nobody wanted a sequel to this, Burton least of all. In the late 90s, Burton also directed another commercial commercial, this time for a French brand of chewing gum called Hollywood Chewing Gum. The plot of the commercial, such as it is, seems to be about a perverted garden gnome who escapes his garden, kicks a cat for no reason, and hitches a ride in a garbage truck to get to a lake where a woman is bathing naked. Rather than being frightened by the perverted gnome watching her, the naked woman smiles at him, and he jumps into the water, and then in a complete non sequitur, the camera pans to show a pack of chewing gum. I'm not sure what the chewing gum has to do with any of it, and maybe there's something about the story that I missed. I think there's something to do with garden gnomes in French culture that I'm not privy to. It reminded me of the whole subplot in Amelie with her sending her father's garden gnome around the world. Of note in Burton's filmography here is that the commercial does use music by Danny Elfman, but it's reused music from Beetlejuice. Alice in Wonderland is another one of those projects like Wednesday that Burton always seemed like a natural fit for, but which in the end just didn't really work out. From what I know about the production, I get the impression that since they were dealing with so many actors being enlarged or shrunk to different scales or digitally modified in some way, they were filming a lot of the movie in little pieces with actors against blue screen doing their parts separately. The problem with that is that I don't think they had a very clear idea of how all these pieces would fit together, and then result is that they don't quite fit together at all. In the end, the movie is just kind of an eyesore and kind of ugly to look at, which is the last thing you'd expect from Tim Burton. The real failure of the movie is on the script level, though. The book, Alice in Wonderland, is episodic. The only real plot is that Alice is trying to get home. She wanders from incident to incident. A lot of the incidents are meaningful or symbolic, but the book as a whole doesn't have anything like the 3-act structure that hack writers in Hollywood use as a crutch. So the movie adds all this stupid stuff about a prophecy and Alice needing to slay the Jabberwocky with the Vorpal sword on the Frabjous day and blah blah blah, and it's just meaningless garbage. But it's how bad screenwriters act like they have a purpose for their story when they don't really. All that stuff structurally is like nails on a chalkboard to me because it's just math. It's not storytelling. It's checking boxes. But what really bothers me is shit like how they use Carroll's words like Vorpal and Frabjous. Lewis Carroll, of course, was a genius with language and wordplay, but while he used lots of invented words and loved nonsensical things, it was never just random gibberish. He coined the word chortle in his Jabberwocky poem, and now it's entered our language because when you hear the line "he chortled in his joy," you know exactly what it means, even if the word didn't exist before. From context and from the perfectly made word, you not only get that chortle is a laugh, but that it's a particular kind of laugh. It seems like he had to invent the word because no other word would have said exactly what he meant to say. Likewise, when the poem says he took his Vorpal sword in hand, you get the impression of the kind of sword it must have been. And when his father says, "Oh, Frabjous day," you get the impression of the type of celebratory day to which he's referring. These weren't magical words or titles. They were words that the characters used as everyday expressions. The word Vorpal is an adjective which could be used to describe a type of sword or a weapon or a type of metal, but in the screenplay for this movie they refer to the Vorpal sword as if Vorpal is the name of one particular legendary sword, when the characters are running around saying, "We have to get the Vorpal sword." If you're familiar with the words from the poem, it sounds like they're saying, "We have to get the sharp sword." I mean, well, what the fuck does that mean? Isn't every sword sharp? It's just a stupid way to use the word. And I wouldn't be so hung up on it if it was just that one word, but I'm using that as an example. It's a pervasive problem with how the screenplay treats the source material. Carroll's invented words were invented so carefully, but Linda Wolverton, who wrote this shitty screenplay, seems to think that he was just making up funny sounds. When you read "Come to my arms, my beamish boy" in the poem, of course you know exactly what beamish means, or you could get several very clear impressions. But what the fuck exactly is futterwhacking supposed to mean? It means nothing at all. It's the difference between a genius writer doing great creative things with language and a Disney employee just making up silly baby talk. Burton, of course, famously isn't a very verbal person, and he doesn't write much for most of his movies. He's even said he barely reads the screenplay because it's just something for him to use as a framework on which to hang his visuals. That doesn't necessarily mean he couldn't adapt something like Alice that depends so much on words, because there's also a lot of potential here for great images. But he needed a writer who could do the verbal part, and in this case he doesn't have one, and it just sinks the entire movie. But as far as the visuals, this is also the rare case where Burton didn't manage to pull that off either. So the end result is a movie which unfortunately manages to fail on almost every level. So naturally, of course, it's one of the most profitable things he ever made. There are a few shots towards the end of the movie showing a flashback with a young Alice in the story as it was in the original book, and those shots are actually beautiful. They look great. I wish Burton would have just made that movie, but instead we got
Utterware.
Prehistoric Cavemen is a short stop-motion movie that Burton made when he was about 13 or possibly younger. And it basically just shows his toy cavemen and some toy dinosaurs playing around in mud near his house before being washed away in a flood. Calling it animation might be a little generous because the figures don't really move much, but I mean, he was a little kid when he made it. We're not judging this to the standards of one of his adult movies. It was a borderline case whether I'd rank this at all, but I wanted this video to be as complete as possible, and this is a short listed on his Internet Movie Database. It hasn't really been officially released, but it was screened at an event and somebody filmed the screen, so there's a very low quality video of it out there if you can find it. It's an interesting footnote in Burton's filmography because it's basically exactly the kind of home movie the kid in Vincent and the Frankenweenie movies is shown making. So it shows how those movies are autobiographical in regards to the things that Burton was doing himself as a child. Like I said with Burton's commercials, it might seem mean-spirited to rank this above Wednesday or above actual completed movies, but like the commercials, this is short, in this case only about 2 minutes, so I'd much rather sit through this again than watch all of Alice in Wonderland or Planet of the Apes. Since I say I'm including this for the sake of completion, this is also a good place to mention the things that Burton has done that I'm not ranking in this video. While Prehistoric Cavemen hasn't officially been released, it is out there for you to find, albeit in a very low quality version, but there are a few things that Burton has made that we know about from interviews and other sources, and which are included on his Internet Movie Database page, but which aren't actually out there for the public to watch. These are mainly a handful of early shorts that were either unfinished animation experiments or home movies that he made as a kid. Most have a few shots out there that have been shown in documentaries and things like that, but never been shown complete as far as I know, so I didn't feel like I could actually rank them. The shorts that I know about are 4 early films that are known as The Island of Dr. Agor, Houdini the Untold Story, Tim's Dreams, one called 1997, and there are also 2 projects from his early days as an animator which are called Stalk of the Celery Monster and King and Octopus Animation. The Island of Dr. Agor is notable for being considered the first thing Burton ever directed at the age of around 13. It's sometimes referred to as an animated film, but I don't think it actually was. At 13, it's doubtful how much animation he could have really done, other than simple stop-motion stuff like Prehistoric Cavemen. And he's also talked about how he shot the film in and around the abandoned cages in an LA zoo.
Well, that's the first time I think we had trouble with the law because we decided to shoot. There's an old abandoned zoo at Griffith Park in LA, so it was my first experience as being like Ed Wood. Okay, let's sneak into the deserted zoo and film there with our Super 8 camera. And so, yeah, I think that was my first road to becoming Ed Wood, really, you know.
The story itself of Dr. Agor is supposed to be a takeoff on Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau, so it fits Burton's enduring themes of monster movies and mad scientists. Of the later animation experiments, Celery Monster is notable because it's supposed to have been what got Burton noticed by Disney, and the job that he then got there was what led to his first professional directing work, but I don't think that the short film was ever actually finished. Most of the shots that have surfaced over the years are unfinished pencil animation, although there are a few seconds you can find with color and sound. Everything else I know that Burton has done has surfaced in some form, and I review all of that in this video. But if you know of anything I'm missing or where you can see the complete version of these 6 shorts that I just mentioned, let me know, because I'd be very curious to see them and add them into a new version of the video. Luau is another early Burton short, this time from 1982, and it's one of 2 that he co-directed with Jerry Rees, who would go on to direct The Brave Little Toaster, among other things. Luau is basically a surreal short film about, as the title suggests, some people on a beach having a luau. I'd rank it higher for the weird experimental stuff, but while it's occasionally funny, there's not a whole lot here. The story, as far as I can tell, is some teenagers on a beach have a luau and sit around mostly making like groaner dad jokes.
Hey, man, wanna feel my muscles? All right!
There's some bizarre stuff with the disembodied head that joins the party at one point and claims to have supernatural powers. Then later, the head has some kind of surf-off with one of the partygoers. Then they decide to relocate to a park for a second luau until some buzzkill businessmen in suits show up and tell them they have to stop because the park is being developed into apartments. This leads to a big melee fighting the businessmen, and Tim Burton shows up in a cameo that's probably the highlight of the short and hits somebody in the face with a pie, apparently killing him because the man jokes on Tim's cream. I'm not making that up. That's what they actually say happens. As I type it out, it all sounds more entertaining than it probably is. But if you just want to see an early Burton experimental short film of him goofing off with his friends and doing some absurdist jokes and stuff, it is fun for what it is. It's much shorter than Alice, and I'd rather sit through this than Alice any day. Doctor of Doom is another early short, the other one that Burton co-directed with Jerry Rees, but I think this one is more interesting than Luau. It's a little more in the gothic style Burton would later come to be associated with. There's another mad scientist here, mad scientist doctor character making monsters, but this time he's played by Burton himself, which is fun. The short is also shot in black and white, so you get a little bit of early shades of Ed Wood or Vincent or Frankenweenie here, although it was made with basically no budget and is mostly shot in their apartment, so it's not going to look as good as any of those later movies. Of note here is that some of the voices were done by Brad Bird, who of course would later go on to direct The Iron Giant and The Incredibles and a bunch of other big movies. It's interesting to realize that Bird and John Lasseter and Rees and Burton were all in film school around the same time together, and they were able to go on to have the careers that they had because at the time Disney was taking chances on distinctive voices and trying out different and new things. None of those people today would be able to have the careers that they had started then if they were starting out at the company that Disney is today.
My beautiful monster, I made you well, and you will be human. Okay, now we will go out and destroy all beautiful things like this painting which I hold in my hand. Go out and destroy all beauty, you understand? All beauty. Now go and kill.
Burton also directed a couple episodes of TV shows back in the early days of his career, in between Pee-wee and Beetlejuice, one of them being an episode of the relaunched Alfred Hitchcock's Presents show called The Jar. The episode isn't that great, but you do get a lot of early intimations of the visual style that Burton was developing. The lighting with the bright planes of color in particular looks a lot like a lot of the scenes dealing with the afterlife in Beetlejuice. I think the middling results here were mostly due to budget and schedule and having less than 30 minutes to tell the story, because there are actually a lot of interesting people involved in this episode. The script was written by Michael McDowell, based on a story by Ray Bradbury, and actually was a remake of an episode of the older version of the Alfred Hitchcock show that was being relaunched here. Although the original episode was technically on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, not Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Michael McDowell would also write Beetlejuice and was a co-writer on Nightmare Before Christmas. McDowell seems to not get talked about much now, and he wasn't involved in the Beetlejuice sequel since he died in 1999, but he did have an interesting career. In addition to his movie and TV work, he wrote several novels which were kind of treated as forgettable paperbacks at the time, but a lot of them have seen reissues over the last decade or so. The Elementals, in particular, is good if you want to read one of his novels. The lead in this episode is played by Griffin Dunne, who was also Jack in An American Werewolf in London. Most notable here for Tim Burton fans, the music in the episode was done by Danny Elfman in their first collaboration after Pee-wee, so this is also a notable entry in their history together. The early version of this story from the Alfred Hitchcock Hour is probably better in the end, but for fans of Burton, this is a notable early entry in his filmography, and it shows a lot of the elements of his style coming together, and it's definitely worth watching.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Welcome to Fairy Tale Theater.
Around the same time, Burton also directed an episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater show, this time telling the story of Aladdin. In this case, I think it was more of a work-for-hire kind of job for Burton, and the script is written by people who had been working on other episodes of Duvall's show, so they weren't Burton's writers. So I think it's more reflective of the show than of what Burton brings to it. It's not a bad episode, though, and if you like Duvall's show, which a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for now, it's a good episode of the show, and Burton does manage to bring in some of his, signature visual flourishes, even though the show is obviously low budget. There are also some nice touches here reminiscent of the French Beauty and the Beast film, which is a classic example of how to create fantasy and whimsy without a lot of technology. Also notable here is that the episode stars both James Earl Jones and Leonard Nimoy. Duvall was able to get a lot of big-name actors for her show, and the episodes benefit from having these big actors have fun with these characters. And it's also worth pointing out that this was released several years before Disney did their animated Aladdin, and this was probably around the time when work on that film was starting, because because while this version is much less well known and was made with much less money, the Disney version seems to rip off several elements from it. The Sultan being kind of a dim-witted goof and the Vizier scheming to marry the princess both seem to have carried over to the Disney version. I'm not 100% certain that this was the first time that they were done that way, but in the original story it's the Vizier's son that wanted to marry the princess. A lot of the look of this episode seems to have been carried over to the Disney version as well, especially with the genie, who here he's blue, he has a top knot, just like in the Disney version. I know there were blue genies before, but it's more than one or two little details here that seem repeated from here to the Disney version. I think that this is notable because it's a classic example of Disney's love-hate relationship with Burton. For decades, they've alternated between firing him and telling him his ideas were too weird and too dark for them, and then also using his ideas to make billions of dollars off of him and off of merchandising stuff that he created. Another lesser-known thing that Burton's done in addition to his feature films is make 2 music videos for the band The Killers. I'm not a big fan of The Killers as a band. They kind of seem like a Mormon Panic at the Disco or something, but their songs have provided a good palette for Burton to make 2 decent little basically short films. The one that he did for their song Bones I think is the less interesting of the 2, but it does have some fun visuals and a lot of classic Burton imagery. The walking skeletons here are of course a Ray Harryhausen homage, and something Burton would also use in movies like Corpse Bride and Mrs. Peregrine. I think additionally in this case the idea of the skeleton band was also an homage to the movie Mad Monster Party. Mad Monster Party was a stop-motion Rankin Bass movie, as were the Rudolph Christmas specials and several other holiday specials like that, and those movies were of course the inspiration for Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Monster Party was kind of their Halloween version of that, with all of the classic movie monsters, including stop-motion versions of Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff, all meeting together on a secluded island run by a mad scientist right out of Dr. Moreau or, out of any number of Burton films. As a little kid, I had Monster Party on a VHS tape recorded off of TV, and I'd watch it over and over and over again. I liked the Rudolph specials too, but I liked Monster Party better. This was the one with the monsters and the Halloween stuff. I think this might have even been a bigger inspiration on Nightmare Before Christmas than Rudolph in some ways. Growing up with those things when I was very young and also living in suburban Southern California, not far from Burbank, where Burton grew up, is why when later I saw something like Nightmare Before Christmas, I felt like I knew exactly what Burton was talking about. The Killers video is good, but I guess what I'm saying is if you're a fan of Tim Burton's work and you haven't seen Mad Monster Party, you should watch that because I think you'd really like it.
Our current project is for the studio showcase on the Disney Channel, and it's a retelling of Hansel and Gretel. And again, it follows the story pretty much. There's the gingerbread house, the witch, and the ovens, 2 kids who are dumped by their stepmother into the forest.
Tim Burton's Hansel and Gretel film was aired one time by Disney and then never shown again, presumably because Disney wasn't happy with it and Burton was reportedly kind of embarrassed by it. In recent years, though, it's shown up again thanks to fans who recorded that original airing on VHS, and it actually isn't that bad. It's not good exactly, but it's ultimately very entertaining, I think, and in a lot of ways it basically serves as the first real live-action Tim Burton movie. A lot of his later visual hallmarks are all here, but this time they're done with a budget that kind of makes a lot of high school plays look extravagant. You can see from what surfaced of a lot of Burton's concept sketches for the short that he obviously wasn't able to accomplish what he had in mind exactly, but you can also see enough in the finished short to get a good idea of what he was trying to do, and the results are, they're entertaining. The bizarre humor and aggressive strangeness and dark moments make for sometimes hilarious kind of nightmare fuel that Disney would never in a million years make today. And it's worthwhile and it's entertaining just for the fact that it's so unique and something that today's homogenized Disney machine would never allow to slip through the cracks. The fact that Disney at the time was a place where a young director could make something weird and personal like this is what allowed Burton to develop into the director that later gave them the movies that he's done with them that have made them billions of dollars in merchandising alone. But today they're too short-sighted to realize that trying new things and letting artists develop can eventually lead to good places, and they'd rather today hire filmmakers they can control like house pets and forced to do endless remakes and the same shit over and over again.
Look, it's only on 7-layer cake and I want it all the way up to little boy!
Burton has been pretty open about the fact that Dumbo was a project like Planet of the Apes, where he dealt with studio interference and wasn't allowed to make the movie that he actually wanted to make, to the point in this case that he said he'll never work with Disney again, and the experience almost made him give up on making movies altogether. Why I'd rank this much higher than Planet of the Apes, though, is that he managed to subversively express that dissatisfaction in the movie itself. You could see it when the movie first came out, but especially in light of Burton's later comments, it's clear that his Dumbo movie is a fairly vicious satire of Disney, and I love the fact that he used Disney's money to do a send-up of Disney. Burton's described his recent years at Disney as being soul-killing and being trapped in a big horrible circus that he needed to escape from. And in the movie, when Dumbo is taken from the small family circus to be exploited by the big horrible corporate circus, there's no denying that that's Burton getting trapped by Disney. He sends up Disney's relentless merchandising, with the circus in the movie suddenly turning Dumbo into a sea of dolls and trinkets and crap. The kind of circus itself is an obvious satire of Disneyland, with garish rides shoved in together and various kind of attractions all stuffed in there, the same way when you're walking around Disneyland. In a few minutes you can go from an Old West attraction to a cruise that's supposed to be in the rainforest.
With advances in both engineering and medicine, the human and the mechanical will soon be combined to assist ordinary families, workers, and veterans.
All of the appliances are improved today. Take a refrigerator. Why, I remember when
the man of the house had to work twice as many hours to earn one as he does now. And today we have a better product.
You took the words right out of my mouth, dear.
It's showing something that started out as sincere and charming, turned into a nightmare hodgepodge of meaningless junk by over-commercialization and thoughtless development. And the story of the movie is that Dumbo needs to escape all this and to run free in his natural habitat, just as Burton was desperate to escape Disney. I originally kind of rolled my eyes at the ending of this movie here, because it seemed bizarre to have a Dumbo movie that seemed to be against animals being in circuses. And it's an ongoing theme with Disney's live-action remakes of their older films to express kind of a distaste for or superiority towards the movies that they're remaking, rather than respect for their history. We're getting a remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs soon, where Disney is afraid of Snow White being white and they don't want to have dwarves, for one example of this. If they feel like the original story isn't suitable for new audiences anymore, then that's fine. They should just leave it alone and make another story, not try to remake the story that they don't like and then contort that original story out of all recognition into something that it's not supposed to be. But in this case, when you realize Dumbo is Burton and the circus he needs to escape is Disney, the ending of the movie makes perfect sense, and it's also kind of satisfying to see. It's satisfying to see Dumbo escape the circus. And while Burton himself might have thought this movie was a horrible experience, and while it's not a great movie in the end, it certainly is better, I would say, than the live-action remakes Disney has done for Peter Pan, or for Little Mermaid, or for Lion King, or for Aladdin, or for any number of their old films that they've butchered recently. This movie definitely won't replace the original Dumbo, but if you look at it as kind of Burton's middle finger to Disney on the way out the door, then it's really actually pretty entertaining on that level.
Everybody worked so hard, but it's a funny movie that way, because at the end we got to destroy it. So it's cathartic.
I read the book for Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children before the movie was announced, because I saw it in a bookstore and I just kind of liked the old-timey photographs in it. And at the time I thought that it was one of those projects like the Addams Family or like Alice in Wonderland that seemed tailor-made for Burton to direct a movie adaptation of. So when the movie was announced, I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't all that excited for it either, since I didn't really think the book was that great. Like I talked about earlier, the story here is basically that plot about school children at a school for children with special powers like X-Men and Harry Potter. And I think it was already a pretty tired cliche at that point, except that it had the twist here of having the old photographs, and the powers were given as an explanation for the odd things that some of the kids seem to be doing in the photos. A lot like Wednesday, though, when they have this setup, they don't really seem to have a whole lot to do with it, but since the story needs to explain why the kids in these old photos would still be kids when the protagonist finds out that the photos are real, Ransom Riggs comes up with this complicated plot device about time loops and the characters inside the time loops living in the same day over and over again, like like Groundhog Day and never aging and all this stuff. This is a little bit easier to explain in a novel, since novels can deliver exposition a little more naturally than films. But in the movie, the result is that the first hour or so of it is kind of a slog, because the characters are just explaining to each other all these rules about how the time loops work and all the rules about the abilities the different peculiar children have and how all that works, and the rules about the bad people that are trying to kill the peculiar children, and on and on. Most of the characters aren't really developed that much beyond explaining what their ability is, and then after the movie finally gets done with an hour and a half of exposition and explaining the backstories, there's actually not a whole lot left to the story, except that then we have to deal with the bad monsters that want to kill the peculiar kids, and the resolution for that is just a big fight scene on a boardwalk that goes on kind of too long, and then that's it. That's the end of the movie. The ending is obviously also supposed to be kind of sequel bait, and there were more books, but after this nobody was really clamoring for more movies. The whole thing allows Burton to come up with some nice visuals and nice set pieces, which I think is obviously why he decided to direct it, but they're all in service of a story that really doesn't deserve them.
Let's see some of the reviews.
Okay, yeah, look, this is the Hollywood Reporter. That's big, trade industry paper. It says, this is the first sentence of the review. Pee-wee's Big Adventure isn't just the funniest movie of the year, it's one of the funniest movies ever!
A delight. I like this movie so well that I've seen it twice. So on and so
Yeah.
forth. Boy, that's very impressive.
Yeah, that's my dad's review.
There's actually nothing wrong with Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and I like it. I just don't rank it among my favorites of Burton's movies, so it ends up kind of in the middle of the list here. It kind of feels like Burton was still finding himself as a director, and he was making this movie for Paul Reubens, and he was making the movie that Paul Reubens wanted as much as he was making a Tim Burton movie. Although I do think he managed to bring a lot of himself to it in some ways. I was actually a big fan of the Pee-wee's Playhouse show as a little kid until it suddenly disappeared from the air for reasons that I didn't understand at the time and that weren't explained to me until I was a little bit older. So I like the Pee-wee character, and this is a good Pee-wee movie. On a list ranking Tim Burton movies, though, it's not as good at being a Tim Burton movie as it is at being a Pee-wee movie. There are fun gags. Paul Reubens is always fun to watch, but I just don't have much of an attachment to this movie. And it's more of a showcase for the character than it is its own piece of art, really. I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I think of great Tim Burton movies, this isn't how I think of them. But there's nothing wrong with it, like I said, and if you like Tim Burton, it's still important as it did launch his future film career, and it led to his next movie, which is where I think Burton truly emerged as the artist that would make an impact. So Pee-wee is very necessary to his filmography. I would say that the 2012 stop-motion version of Frankenweenie is better than it got credit for, but I think it's in a difficult position since Burton made the movie twice, which sets it up for being compared to the earlier version and encourages people to second-guess his creative decisions and decide for themselves which version they like better. Michael Haneke's 2007 English-language remake of Funny Games is good, and it might be seen as great if he hadn't already made the movie in 1997, so you could watch the two versions side by side and decide that the earlier one is better, which makes the second one seen as a lesser movie by comparison, even though it's not bad on its own.
When we met up with Tim, one of the questions that I felt we needed to ask him was why do a feature film of something that he'd already done very successfully? Tim's reply was that he wanted to put more of a performance in with Sparky, the dog.
Here, Burton gives the full stop-motion treatment to a movie that he had originally filmed in live action, and maybe this is how he always wanted to do it and he couldn't before for reasons of money or time, or maybe doing it as stop-motion occurred to him later as a way to do a new spin on the story. And either way, the stop-motion animation looks great, as it always does when Burton does it, but overall I think the earlier version has a charm to it that the remake doesn't quite match. In the stop-motion version, everything looks like a Tim Burton design, which is great to look at, but it doesn't necessarily serve the story all that well, because the whole thing of a boy bringing his dog back to life seems funnier if it's happening in what seems like a relatively normal suburb. But in the stop-motion version, everything here looks like it's from a Frankenstein movie. Victor doesn't really seem like the kind of weird kid at school because all of Victor's friends seem weirder than he is. The undead dog seems like he'd fit right in this setting instead of being weird and scary to these people, instead of being shocking. And it loses the subversion of the kind of unsettling idea of a boy bringing dead animals back to life happening in what otherwise on the surface looks like a Leave It to fever kind of neighborhood. These kids in this version look like digging up roadkill and bringing it back to life would be second nature to them. And in the third act of the remake, that's actually where the story goes, when a bunch of the neighborhood kids decide that they also want to bring their pets back from the dead, and suddenly we have all kinds of undead animal monsters running around. In one way, this is clever and it allows for some fun opportunities because it allows Burton to do riffs on a bunch of other classic monster movies instead of just Frankenstein. And then we get pets coming back as versions of everything from Godzilla to the Mummy. And while that's all kind of fun, it also kind of seems like padding to stretch the movie out. The other problem here is that the original version was only 30 minutes, which is more than enough time to tell the story. But in this case, they needed to find things to make it feature length. Most of the additions are entertaining, but it distracts from the core of the story, which is a boy and his dog story, which was the heart of the original version, and what gave it emotional weight. Most people can remember being a child and having a huge emotional connection to a pet, and how devastating it was when the pet died. And the friendship between a boy and his dog is great material that's made for any number of, heart-tugging children's stories. In the Frankenweenie remake, where they had to add an hour of extra material, Sparky and Victor almost get forgotten about for long stretches of the movie. And what could have on one level been kind of touching in a twisted way, that this boy loved his dog so much that he wanted to defy God and tamper with the laws of life and death, seems less special when half of the neighborhood kids here are also doing it. I do like that they added the message that Sparky comes back good because Victor brought him back out of love, whereas most of the other animals come back as monsters because the kids brought them back for the wrong reasons. But the story of Sparky and Victor does still get buried in all of this mayhem, and I think that the simpler version of the story is ultimately better.
This is one of the stories out of the book I did, Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy. It's called Stainboy. Of all the superheroes, the strangest one by far doesn't have a special power or drive a fancy car. Next to Superman and Batman, I guess he must seem tame, but to me he is quite special, and Stainboy is his name. He can't fly around tall buildings or outrun a speeding train. The only talent he seems to have is to leave a nasty stain. Sometime I know it bothers him that he can't run or swim or fly, and because of his one ability, his dry cleaning bill's sky high. These are stories for people with very short attention spans.
Burton's Stainboy shorts are in the end very simple little jokes, basically, only a couple of minutes each. But for what they are, I think that they're very entertaining. And they showcase a bit of an edge that I think Burton always has, but that he sometimes has to tamp down because he's making movies with large budgets that need to have certain ratings and reach certain audiences. With a smaller short like this that's not as expensive and that doesn't have the same expectations, he can be a bit more transgressive, which is where I think most of the comedy comes from here. There's a whole world of Burton's sketching and poetry that I think people who only know him from his movies don't really appreciate, and I think that stuff is as important to him as his more mainstream work. You get to see a little bit of it in Stainboy, and I think that's certainly closer to his heart than something like Dumbo. Burton has said, and you can see that it's true, that any project he's working on, he has to find a personal connection to it. So, in a way, a project like Dumbo is still personal to him. Like I was saying about Dumbo, you can see that even in that case, he found a way to make that movie autobiographical for him, and to smuggle in his anger at Disney and personal things. But I think in the case of something like Stainboy, I think this is more like the real Burton on the surface without having to search for him in the subtext.
For polluting the atmosphere, using and mixing of toxic chemicals in dangerous and lethal combinations, destroying landscape and property, disrupting the balance of nature, causing great harm to society. Son, you're a regular one-man Walt Disney Company.
I actually really love the second video that Burton did with the Killers, which is called Here With Me. It's ultimately a music video to promote their song, so Burton has to have the obligatory shots of the band singing and everything. But aside from that, he's made a great little short film here that's about a boy who's obsessed with a celebrity actress. On one level, you'd think it's kind of a touching story about unrequited love, and that the boy is a typical Burton stand-in and an outsider that's unnoticed and underappreciated. But it takes a humorous but also kind of creepy turn as the boy not being able to have the actress that he's in love with instead obsesses over a mannequin that looks like her. The mannequin he can control and carry around with him on imaginary little dates, and he can dress it up how he likes and do what he wants with it. It's really kind of creepy and weird, but also sad and entertaining. You feel bad for him, but also kind of laugh at him. And at the same time, you're also kind of a little frightened by him because he's obviously a little fucked in the head. The kind of obsessive stalker stare Craig Roberts, who plays the boy, gives in shots of him staring at Winona Ryder, who plays the actress, is both funny and weird, but also kind of a little scary. I wish Roberts would have made more movies with Burton. He had the right vibe. In real life, this kind of stalker obsession, though, isn't really cute. It might end very badly. So the short video has a bit of mounting apprehension, but the story resolves itself metaphorically with the boy and the mannequin both turning out to be wax candles, and the boy lighting them both and melting them down. You can take it to be symbolic of any number of endings, but it's also a beautiful image, and it avoids showing an actual murder-suicide or something like that wouldn't have been funny or suitable for a music video. Even though this was done as a music video, it's still another example of Burton being able to show a bit more of an edge and a bit more of his darker side here, and deal with a little bit with sexual obsession and things that have to be much more subtextual when he's working on a Disney movie. And the short has a lot of great Burton imagery. It's a totally entertaining video, and it's probably better than the song deserves and better than some of the work for hire kind of features or TV episodes that Burton has done. Corpse Bride is a great looking movie, and I love stop motion, so it's fun to watch. It's a short movie at about 1 hour and 17 minutes, but the folktale it's based on can be told in a couple of pages. So even at the short running time, the story to me feels a little bit padded and thin. It's not bad, it's just sometimes feels kind of unnecessary. I think the real problem with this movie is the music, and I love Danny Elfman's work on Burton's earlier movies, but here he doesn't really produce any great or particularly memorable songs, which is a problem for a musical. There are certainly no songs here on the level of the songs in The Nightmare Before Christmas, which maybe isn't a fair standard to hold it to since that movie is something really special. But when you have Burton and Elfman back together doing a very similar stop-motion animated project and it's a musical, the comparison is inevitable. Burton is returning to familiar themes here, of course, down to having another pale, black-haired Burton stand-in who even has the same name as Victor from Frankenweenie. And that's not a problem that he's doing that. Every artist has their recurring themes that they return to, but the problem is that here the way he uses most of these ideas isn't really as good as when he's used the same ideas elsewhere. Still, like I said, the movie is great to look at and it's not a bad movie. It's just that if you wanted that feeling you got from Nightmare Before Christmas, you'd probably just be better off watching Nightmare Before Christmas instead. Burton made Big Fish after his father died, and he's talked about how he wanted to express the emotions he was going through, coming to terms with the fact that we never really know another person completely, and the parts of your parents' lives that we weren't involved in will always kind of be a mystery to us. So there's this emotional core to the movie that's very sincere and very meaningful. I'd imagine there's also something Burton relates to in the story of somebody telling his own autobiography again and again, but in fantastical and partly fictional variations, since that's basically what he spent most of his career doing. The movie was still never really one of my favorites of Burton's, though, because while there's a lot to like about it, the overall result struck me as kind of somewhat mawkish or slight, maybe. I think there was something about the combination of the emotional earnestness and the silliness of some of the fantasy scenes that didn't really gel together entirely. I rewatched it recently, though, and now I'm closer to the age that Burton was when he originally made it, and although my dad is still alive, my mom died recently. So I think this time I did relate a lot more to what Burton was trying to express, even if the movie doesn't always work completely. Usually Burton manages to create that balance between the serious and the silly really successfully. It's kind of a hallmark of his work. Just for some reason here, the balance always seemed a little bit off to me. The present day parts of the movie with Jessica Lange and Albert Finney playing the older version of Edward Bloom are actually really good and affecting. Lange is great without a lot of screen time, and I like Edward Bloom's tall tales more when Finney is telling them than when Ewan McGregor is acting them out. The scenes with McGregor as the young Bloom are fine, but they don't have much weight to them, and they aren't as interesting as the scenes with the older Bloom and his wife and son. Still, I mean, in the end, I'm kind of quibbling and explaining why I put it in the middle of my ranking of Burton's movies instead of higher up, but it's a good movie with a lot of really beautiful moments in it, and it doesn't deserve to be dismissed as I've seen some people do. The criticism I've seen of Mars Attacks many times is that screwball comedy isn't Tim Burton's strong suit, which I think is just kind of a strange thing to say because if you watch his movies, they're almost all comedies. I think what's different about Mars Attacks is that most of the others have a stronger protagonist to give them an emotional core, whereas this time it's mostly just the farce without a character like that. I think what's missing for people who compare this negatively to his other movies is one of the Burton stand-in characters, you know, a thin, pale boy or man with wild black hair and a moody disposition and a name like Victor or Vincent. Mars Attacks does have Richie, who's the sensitive kid whose family doesn't understand him and so on, which I think is this movie's version of that Burton character, but the movie doesn't spend very much time on him. In the end, it's a movie about cartoon Martians blowing stuff up, and I don't think the carnage would have been as fun to watch if you were too emotionally attached to the characters. It's supposed to be a farce, so saying it's a farce isn't really a criticism. If you want to find deeper meaning in it that isn't necessarily supposed to be there, you might see the Martian invasion almost as some sort of biblical reckoning or day of judgment. Because if you're keeping score at the end of the movie, you'll find that almost all of the characters that get killed are the bad people, the ones who are venal or vain or selfish, while Richie and the other characters who are good or who try to help people end up surviving and saving the day. Richie's family is mostly concerned with protecting their trailer and their possessions when the Martians come, but Richie insists on leaving the trailer to go protect his grandma. And of course, as soon as he leaves the trailer is destroyed and his family is presumably killed in it, but because he did the right thing and left, Richie isn't there, so he's spared, and his grandma ends up being the character that ends up figuring out how to defeat the Martians. But all of that also might just be a screenwriting decision, because if you want a movie to be fun for people, people won't enjoy it as much if you're killing the characters who are likable, so the likable ones are more likely to be spared. And then you can see Burton having just a lot of fun making little sketches of the kinds of people who can make life on this planet kind of annoying and difficult at times, and then having the Martians come in and melt their faces off, which I think is the appeal of the movie, getting to see camp sci-fi mayhem and hostile aliens unleashed on Earth, and you don't have to feel too bad about being entertained by it because it's mostly a cartoon and the people the Martians take out mostly kind of deserve it. And it is funny and it's entertaining. I think on all those levels it really works. If you're looking for another Ed Wood or something, this isn't it, but it isn't meant to be that either. It's more of a movie that Ed Wood would have made than a movie a filmmaker in more serious mode would make about Ed Wood. Talking about the stop-motion remake of Frankenweenie, I already touched on both movies and I already kind of explained why I prefer this version to the other. But to just talk about this movie, it really is a great little short film. This actually launched Burton's professional directing career in a lot of ways, as it caused quite a buzz among the people who saw it at the time. It didn't get officially released at the time because it was seen as too dark to put it before a theatrical animated movie, which was the original intention. But it did get around, with even people like Stephen King seeing it and praising it, leading to many industry connections for Burton. When Paul Rubens saw it, it led him to offer Burton the Pee-wee movie, and after that he was off to the races as a professional feature director. And when you see the short, you can see why people liked it so much. The central idea is actually kind of disturbing, but Burton handles the tone deftly, and the end result is more endearing and charming than anything else. That emotional core that I said kind of got lost in the remake really shines through here, and you end up finding something very emotional about a boy turning mad scientist to bring back his dog from the dead. Burton's humor and sensibility are already on full display here, even so early in his career, and you can see in retrospect all the potential this points to for his future. Of course, the originality and edge that make the short so worthwhile are the exact same reasons Disney would never make something like this today. And they aren't bright enough to realize that if there was another Burton now, they'd be too short-sighted to let him develop, much to their own loss. Tim Burton's Dark Shadows movie has a lot of people that hate it, but I actually think it's one of Burton's most enjoyable movies, especially out of the times that he's been reimagining an existing series rather than making something new. I think the problem that a lot of people ran into here is that they were expecting more of a gothic romance and got a screwball comedy, but it's not like the original show in this case was exactly all that serious to begin with. There's a camp thing built into this material, and it actually suits Burton's aesthetic really well. A lot of people selectively view Burton through one aspect of the material he creates, in a lot of cases zeroing in on the dark or gothic or moody aspects. But what actually makes Burton more interesting than somebody just doing gothic designs for emo teenagers is that there's a tension in his material between that kind of thing and other divergent aesthetics. The real spirit of Burton comes through when you combine the gothic or dark with the tacky tacky and the campy. His point of view isn't just the classic monster movies he loves, it's those movies through the eyes of a kid watching them on a small TV in suburban 60s or 70s Burbank. Of course, this is most clearly expressed in Edward Scissorhands, where you have the gloomy Gothic castle, but it's up on a hill over a neighborhood of tacky, mass-produced suburban homes with bright sun and manicured lawns and questionable paint choices. In Dark Shadows, you get the big Victorian haunted mansion, but there's also a teenager in there whose room is decorated with lava lamps. The effect is kind of like if the Partridge Family moved into Shirley Jackson's Hill House. You could tell Burton was having a lot of fun with the idea of the centuries-old vampire buried, chained in a coffin, rising from the dead, and then the first thing he sees is an ugly fluorescent McDonald's sign. That's where Burton's aesthetic is, and also his sense of humor, really in the tension between those things, the beautiful and strange and the mass-produced and tacky. So if you like Burton, I don't really understand not liking this movie. It's worth it just for the sets and costumes, but I also like the characters. I thought it was really funny. I enjoyed this whole thing. I think people who didn't like it before might like it better now if they gave it another chance and didn't go in expecting the horror movie that it was never meant to be. Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is basically a perfect movie up until the point that they actually get to the chocolate factory, and then it gets just, a little bit iffy. I don't think the problem with it after that point is that it's bad so much as that once they get to Wonka, this movie is inevitably in competition with Gene Wilder's version of the character, and his version is so classic and beloved. The original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie was far from perfect, and Roald Dahl himself famously didn't like how it turned out, even though he'd written the script, so there's definitely room for a new interpretation. It's not one of those classic movies that's so perfect to remake is pointless. But what is great about that original movie is Wilder's performance, and even though that's not the only way you can interpret the character, almost any other version is going to suffer by comparison. What Johnny Depp does here is try to not imitate what Wilder did, which would have failed, but instead to do something completely different, which is a smart decision. But the problem with something so completely different when people already had a certain set of expectations is that it left a lot of people confused as to what the fuck they were even watching. In the end, it was kind of a lose-lose. He couldn't do exactly the same thing, but people would also feel that anything different was wrong somehow. Given that obstacle, I think the movie is admirable in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways besides that one way, it's actually an improvement on the original movie. I go back and forth in my mind on whether Tim Burton's Batman or Batman Returns is better, and if I'm watching one of them, I usually like whichever one I'm currently watching best. This is because they're such radically different movies, comparing them is kind of apples and oranges, which is a good thing. Now the goal of superhero franchises is to follow a formula and give fans the same movie that they think they want again and again, but Burton has talked about how he didn't really consider Batman Returns to be a sequel, just another different movie on the same theme. This is a good approach to it. He's talked a lot recently about how he wouldn't be interested in doing a superhero movie now because the circumstances are completely different. Everything wasn't a franchise when he made his Batman movies. His movies were just allowed to be movies and to exist on their own rather than as a means to other ends. This is what made them successful, but studios took the wrong lesson from it and created a situation where they can't do this ever again. Burton's talked a lot about how when he was doing Batman Returns, it was presented to him as a problem that McDonald's didn't know how to make Happy Meal toys out of the movie because they thought that the imagery was too gross, and how that was a completely bizarre thing to be concerned about to him. But now, of course, Marvel would have talked to the toy companies and met all their demands and worked all that out, usually before they even have a director hired. The reason the marketing people descended on Batman Returns is because Burton's first Batman movie was so successful that they saw this could be a cash cow. But the reason Burton's first Batman movie was successful is because he wasn't focusing on any of that stuff. And trying to wring out every last scrap of profit, these companies strangle their own golden goose. They don't understand that to have profitable art, they need to just let it be art first and then try to figure out how to sell it after. If you go in from the start with the goal of just making Happy Meal toys, not making an interesting movie, then you won't have a movie that's interesting enough to sell any Happy Meal toys. Burton's talked a lot about how he got reactions to this movie, both saying that it was too dark and disturbing and scary, and also saying that it was too silly and too cartoonish. When he made it, he wasn't thinking on any of those metrics or trying to appeal to fan demands about how dark or how silly it should be. The success of his first Batman movie allowed him this time to just make the movie he wanted to, and as with all his movies, that meant a mixture of some darkness with some whimsy and humor. The success of his first Batman allowed him to make this one how he wanted, but then the fact that he made this one how he wanted made the studio too scared to give him free rein again, and they didn't want him back for a third one. So this movie exists in kind of a brief gap between when Burton's first Batman invented, in many ways, the modern superhero blockbuster, and when the studios rushed in to clamp down on the whole thing and monetize it. For this reason, it's kind of a unique moment in film history, and the last time a superhero movie could be this unique and personal, and for that, I enjoy it a lot. still remember when Burton's first Batman movie came out, although I wasn't even allowed to see it because I was 6 and my mom thought it would be too dark and scary for me. Even though I wasn't allowed to see it though, I was really aware of it at the time because it became this cultural phenomenon.
People are flocking to retail outlets to get their share of Batmania.
Now, what do you think?
Retailers think it's wonderful, and they pulled out all the Bat stops. Bat shoes, Bat towels, Bat shirts, Bat mugs, and none of the Bat goods are hanging around.
Well, like the Joker t-shirt, I wish I had one here to show you, but obviously we've had a couple of orders of those come in. They're gone. The hats are gone. I mean, it's just certain items that just continue to go.
I think it's going to be rad.
Really? What's rad?
Radical.
Okay.
Cool.
Batman's become hip and cool, and people can come out of the closet and admit that they read Batman and that comics are in vogue now.
I remember seeing the toys in stores and the commercials on TV, and I remember bookstores having tables with stacks of Batman comics up by their entrance, which was the first time I'd ever seen stacks of comics in a bookstore. Before that, I usually saw comics on racks in gas stations or at the supermarket. The modern superhero industry as it exists now really wasn't around at all then, which is why Burton was allowed to make a strange and unique movie like he made in the first place. It would never happen now because there's too much at stake. The directors of superhero movies now aren't really directing them. The studios are making all the important decisions, which is why superhero movies are a dead and pointless genre. But back when Burton made his first Batman movie, it all seemed very new and exciting. It was the same in comic books at the time too, in a couple ways, with comics struggling to find the new identity and the stakes being much lower than they are now when they're owned by major corporations who just use them as R&D departments for major movie franchises. At the time, they were actually interested in selling comics, which is why in those years, things like Watchmen and Dark Knight and The Killing Joke could happen, but they haven't done anything comparable in almost 4 decades since. Now, instead of a new Watchmen, we get shitty cash-in prequels like before Watchmen. Since I wasn't allowed to see Burton's Batman when it was new, but I was still inundated with imagery from the movie, I had my own version of the movie that I imagined on my own, and when I finally saw the movie, it didn't disappoint. You could say Burton's first Batman movie is dark, I guess, but it's not dark in the way that mindless Watchmen knockoffs are now, where they have an adolescent notion that adding sex and violence makes something more adult. Burton's Batman was dark and then it had gloomy, gothic imagery, and the bad guys were bad enough to be dangerous, but it was still a Batman movie. It wasn't concerned with being realistic. It didn't pretend that a man dressing up like a bat isn't a little silly. It wasn't ashamed of the fact that its source material was for children, while still not being overtly childish in a way that seemed patronizing. In other words, it was the perfect Batman movie for me when I was 6 and seeing the commercials, and when I was 7 or 8 and eventually allowed to see the movie itself. And because it wasn't patronizing, it's a Batman that's still fun for me to watch as an adult. That tension between darkness and silliness characterizes so much of Burton's work, and it's perfect for a character like Batman, but it's those same qualities of allowing in the silliness that fans today and fans of recent superhero movies would rebel against, so that's why we don't get something like this anymore.
Another project that Tim and I worked on together was an experiment with stop-motion animation for which I took Tim's designs and created puppets in 3-dimensional sets.
It's basically the story of a little boy who thinks that he's Vincent Price. And it comes from my childhood experiences, and as I had sort of a identification, I thought, with Vincent Price. These are some of the characters he has to deal with in the film. Here's his aunt and his mother, and this was his beautiful wife that haunted him, and his little dog Abercrombie, whom he tormented from time to time.
It's really kind of amazing when you think about it what a complete worldview Burton managed to fit into this short little film so early in his career. If you knew somebody who had never seen anything by Burton and you wanted to show them what he's about, at the end of this little 6-minute short, they would basically get it. Of course, Burton later developed these themes and ideas a lot more, but his whole personality and his whole aesthetic is here, fully formed, almost like right out of the gate. It's easily the best of the early short films that he made in his career. For me, I think Big Eyes proves Burton's detractors wrong when they say that he hasn't made any good movies in 20 years. The problem with Burton movies from the last decade or two that don't work usually comes down to the script, but with Big Eyes, Burton had a great script by the same people who wrote Ed Wood, and he had a subject that was suited for him in Margaret Keane, which allowed him to explore both one of his usual sensitive outsider artist protagonists and also themes about art and culture that appeal to him. With this fascination with the tension between what you might call high and low culture and the way he likes to juxtapose the beautiful and personal with the mass-produced and tacky, you can see why he'd be fascinated with Keen's paintings, which embody both. On the one hand, they were undeniably kitsch, and the kind of thing you'd see cheap prints of in people's kitchens, like art for people who don't actually know all that much about art, like Thomas Kincaid or people like that. But on the other hand, Keen seems to have made them from a genuine place. She wasn't making tacky art because of a calculated marketing scheme to market to people who like that kind of thing. She was making art with images that appealed to her, and she happened to hit on a cultural moment where what appealed to her also appealed to a lot of other people, much like how a lot of people might dismiss Burton's work as being lowbrow because it appeals to such a broad audience, and he's doing things like superhero movies and Disney remakes, but at the same time he's always doing those things because they genuinely appeal to him in some way. Where his movies fail is when he's not allowed to make them as he'd like them to be, and studios come in to modify what he wanted to do to what they perceive as a more commercial version. That removes the genuine intention that kept what he was doing from being the generic product it would have been in the hands of somebody who cares less. With his films about Keen or Ed Wood, they work and have emotional depth because he's not making them to make fun of people who are often portrayed as bad artists who made junk, but rather because he genuinely finds something interesting about their artistic temperament and their desire to create. I think Sleepy Hollow might be Burton's most beautiful looking film. It also might be the closest he's ever come to doing full-on horror, which is interesting given that his filmography is always preoccupied with horror and monster movies. But even here he's not exactly doing straight horror so much as an homage to a particular kind of horror movie that he loved growing up, in this case the Hammer horror movies of the 50s and 60s. Those movies were relaunches of a lot of characters Burton loved from earlier horror movies from the 30s and 40s, only now with color and more blood and more cleavage, but there was still a stylized beauty to them. The blood in those movies looked more like melted crayon than real blood, which at the time was close to what was usual for fake blood in a lot of movies. But in the 90s, when movie blood usually looked much more real, Burton was careful to still recreate the melted crayon aesthetic. Everything in the movie has a handmade look. Most of the time when they're in the forest, it's a soundstage, so they aren't real trees, they're Tim Burton trees. Everything has a look that's carefully controlled, but also just imperfect enough that you can still tell that it was made, not found. There's another burning windmill at the end, just like in Frankenstein and in both of Burton's Frankenweenie movies. They're never in an actual historical period, they're in the movies that were made about those historical periods, which is what allows Burton to have a heightened reality with the story and with the acting and still have it seem real and correct for the setting in which the story is happening. I wish Burton would do more R-rated movies, not because I want more violence or gore, because nothing in this movie is really very scary. Burton has always said that in monster movies he wasn't scared of the monsters, he felt sympathy for them, but rather because it lets Burton not have to shave the edges off things. The MPAA doesn't differentiate between realistic blood and melted crayon blood. They'll give the movie an R rating either way, but in Burton's case, his blood is like paint, and when he has an R rating, he can go full Jackson Pollock. I think in a lot of cases with Burton's movies, he has visuals that he wants to accomplish, and they're going to be expensive, so the trade-off to get a studio to give him the money he needs is that he does something from an existing series or something with a PG rating so that it has a broader potential audience. I think Sleepy Hollow having an R rating makes it one of the movies where he was allowed to have a broader range. So I'm relieved to report that Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is actually really fucking great. I expected to like it because I thought it would be great just to see Burton doing these characters again, but it's actually so much better than I hoped or expected. I was interested to see how Burton would do a sequel because he's never really done that before besides Batman Returns, and like I was talking about earlier, that one isn't really a sequel so much as it's just a different movie that also has Batman. In the case of Beetlejuice Beetlejuice though, Burton's trying to make more of a direct sequel that has the same look and feel as the first one and feels like a continuation of that story. One of the interesting things that he does here is that he tries to do that by making a film that's much more character driven this time. The first Beetlejuice is more of a plot-driven movie in that the story is generated by the premise. Ghosts who don't like people who moved into their house, and so they want to haunt them and make them leave, eventually resorting to getting a bioexorcist to scare them away. You could do that same premise with any number of different characters, although the characters they came up with in the first movie are pretty great. This movie is much more driven by those characters and what happens to them next and where their lives go. Because it's a continuation in that way, the danger is that it would just be more of the same. The alternative would be to have Beetlejuice doing a new case with some new premise and not really use the Dietzes was, or the locations of the first film. And from the trailers and everything, I was kind of concerned that this one would just be a rehash of all the stuff we've already seen. While it does, in the end, check almost every box or something you'd like to see again from the first movie, the great thing is that it's also wildly creative. Almost all of the callbacks and fan service in this movie are things that were already shown in the trailers, and the rest of the movie is actually full of new ideas, some of which I thought were genuinely surprising and all of which were entertaining. I was going to do this review without spoilers since I'm posting it so soon after the movie comes out, but there are so many things here that I want to talk about that I've decided I'm going to do a spoilers section. So if you don't want to hear spoilers yet, just skip ahead until the screen doesn't say Beetlejuice spoilers anymore. But, go see the movie because it's really good. The only thing in this movie that maybe didn't work for me was the musical number at the wedding at the end of the movie, because it felt like it was a callback that was unnecessary and maybe went on for too long. For some reason, they seemed to feel like they had to do a new version of the Deo scene from the first movie, and they could have done something else instead. But it isn't terrible, and I might like it more when I rewatch the movie. Although I think they could have done a different version of this scene, there is a purpose to this scene, which I'll talk about in a second, which I think actually elevates the whole movie and gets better the more that you think about it. At the end of the wedding sequence, I actually kind of felt bad for Beetlejuice. He held up his end of the bargain, he saved Astrid and Lydia, he sent Astrid's evil ghost boyfriend to hell or something. He even brought Delia back so that she could say goodbye. And then after he does all that, Lydia cheats him and she doesn't marry him. I mean, I know the thought of marrying Beetlejuice isn't pleasant, but she did make the deal, and he did more nice things for her than he had to. But then there's the question, though, of whether she actually did cheat him. The end of the movie for a second seems like a typical scene where something terrible happens and then the character wakes up, realizes it was all a dream, and then that's the end. But when Lydia wakes up, Beetlejuice wakes up in bed next to her, right? So is she still dreaming? Was this Beetlejuice's dream? When exactly does she wake up? The interesting thing about the musical number, in light of this part at the end of the movie, is that there's a moment in the musical number where Beetlejuice breaks the fourth wall, looks into the camera, and tells you that it's a dream sequence. If that's a dream, between that moment and the moment when Lydia's marriage contract is burned up, there's actually no moment showing clearly that anybody woke up. In the end, when she wakes up and Beetlejuice is in bed with her, it could be a dream within a dream, like when you wake up inside of your dream but you're still asleep and you're actually having a night terror. But it could also be a dream within a dream within a dream. Where did the dream sequence actually start? Was any of that part where Lydia was traveling with Astrid real, or was that all a dream? Did Astrid really get married and Lydia dream the pregnancy? Or is Astrid's whole marriage a dream? Is everything after the musical number a dream? If it is, that has interesting implications. Like I said before, that sequence is a dream according to Beetlejuice, and then they never show any characters waking up. The only time they show them waking up is when Lydia wakes up in bed next to Beetlejuice. So is she actually married to him? I mean, she did sign the contract, right? Astrid cites a rule from the handbook for the recently deceased that annuls the contract, and the contract burns up. But if the contract burns because it's invalid, why didn't it burn up before Astrid pointed that out? And how does Astrid already happen to know this obscure rule from the handbook that the other characters don't? Why are these characters acting in some ways like they've already been in the afterlife for a while? The whole movie is playing with this idea about the boundaries between life and death being blurred, right? Astrid going out with a boy and not realizing he's dead and so on, all that kind of thing. They introduced the idea earlier on with Lydia's boyfriend going to the afterlife and seeing Beetlejuice, but then thinking that it was all a dream. They're already introducing the whole idea of this being a dream sequence, or characters thinking that they're dreaming when they're not. The whole movie is framed like this, actually, with the opening where you think that you're looking at Adam Maitland's model, but then in the window there's the real Lydia. But then when they show where Lydia is, she still isn't in the real attic. She's on a TV set that looks like the attic. This is a clever inversion, of course, of the opening of the original movie, where you think it's supposed to be a model representing a real place, like they often do in movies, but then a spider crawls over the top of the house, and you realize that you're supposed to know it's actually a model. It's not supposed to be representing the real place. This is a theme Burton plays with actually throughout his whole filmography, about the line between art and artifice, with the special effects sometimes looking deliberately fake to call your attention to the fact that you're looking at something that was handmade, not something that was found. He's not just interested in the thing that his art is depicting, but also in the act of how the thing is depicted in the art. The fact that you're looking at his depiction of the thing as opposed to the thing itself. These levels of unreality and artifice are working on another level of symbolism in both of the Beetlejuice movies, as they're concerned with the afterlife existing alongside our world and the different levels of reality existing parallel to one another. Inside life is another level of reality in the afterlife. afterlife. And then in this movie, we see that there are apparently other levels within that. The ghost boyfriend seems to go into some kind of hell from the afterlife. And then there's the soul train that's taking people already in the afterlife, apparently to a more permanent afterlife. It seems like the afterlife bureaucracy we see in these movies is a kind of purgatory, and then there are other levels after that. There's a question here of if when Beetlejuice's wife sucks the soul out of somebody that's already dead, what exactly is she doing to them? Are they dying again, or going to another level of the afterlife, or maybe being trapped in some kind of limbo so they can't go on to where they might have gone in the soul train? We get hints of this kind of thing in the first movie, with the exorcism of ghosts being called Death for the Dead, and exorcised ghosts seeming to be trapped in some kind of afterlife within another level of afterlife. According to the first movie, dead people who aren't ready to move on yet stay in the land of the living as ghosts for a period of time that varies from manifestation to manifestation. Then they move on to the bureaucracy level where Beetlejuice exists, which is another level beyond that. Then in this movie, we get hints of what happens when people move past that level. There's also the desert place with the sandworms, which seems to be some kind of world within worlds, when people try to pass between levels, but they aren't ready to go to the next place yet. Part of the fun of the Beetlejuice movies is that all these rules that they set up about how the afterlife works don't always make sense, and they aren't always consistent, but there's still this interesting theme of levels of reality and planes of existence existing inside of one another. And in this movie, the idea of dreams within dreams and not knowing if the characters are awake or not, combined with him playing with the ideas in several cases of not knowing for sure if the character is dead or not, is actually really interesting, and it creates a creepy, disorienting world, which I think not only makes sense with the first Beetlejuice movie, but it even adds a lot more depth to it.
From the director of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Michael Keaton is Beetlejuice.
Beetlejuice, in a lot of ways, is what I consider to be the first full Tim Burton feature film. And he comes out of the gate with a fully formed identity. This could be his most fun movie, maybe, and it's certainly one of his most inventive. At the time, it was on lists of the worst films of the year, which I think is because it was just so different that people didn't really know what to do with it. It didn't fulfill most of the normal expectations you'd have going to a movie. But in retrospect, everything about it works. This is another of Burton's movies where everything has a designed and handmade look, which I think gets lost in some of his movies that look more polished and perfect. The combination here of stop motion with animation and live action in some of the scenes is really beautiful to look at. The characters are all great, especially Lydia, of course. The music is fantastic. The potential in the match between Tim Burton and Danny Elfman in their first two previous collaborations finds the perfect opportunity here. To this day, 30 years later, it's still just kind of a weird movie and there's nothing else that's really like it. But you also get the feeling that it wasn't ever just being weird for the sake of being weird. Maybe they couldn't explain it exactly, but everybody working on this movie seemed to have some kind of purpose they were working to, and they were following their own muse where it led, and somehow all of this worked in concert.
Hi, this is Johnny Depp, and we're here in Hollywood, California, downtown Hollywood, California, and we're shooting a film called Ed Wood. We're in a meat plant. I do a striptease in a meatpacking plant.
Like I said when I was talking about Big Eyes, what makes that movie and Ed Wood work is that Burton's not making these movies to laugh at these people. He's making them from a place of genuine interest in them and appreciation for them. Since Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space is commonly considered the worst or one of the worst movies ever made, people might assume the purpose of making a movie about it was just to stare at the train wreck. But when Burton talks about Ed Wood, he's always quick to compare Wood to himself. He talks about his experience making his first movies as a teenager being like how Ed Wood made movies, having no money and no filming permits, just sneaking into a location with cameras and trying to grab what they could before somebody came in to kick them out. In Ed Wood's case, maybe the end result wasn't Citizen Kane, but that desire to make art in spite of having no resources is still admirable, and to an artist like Burton, I think it's inspirational. His movie, Ed Wood, softens some of the realities of Ed Wood's life to tell an almost mythologized version of it, and focuses carefully on certain periods. In real life, Wood had a pretty miserable existence, and he ended up directing porn and died pretty young. Plan 9 came and went without really being noticed. It didn't even get the dubious honor of being labeled as the worst movie ever made until much later, so Wood didn't even really get to enjoy that kind of notoriety. But what Burton's celebrating here is a spirit of creativity more than a literal version of Wood's life, and he makes the whole thing into a kind of beautiful fairy tale. I love Danny Elfman's work on Burton's early movies, but I think something that people have sensed is missing in some of Burton's more recent projects is that the music isn't quite as distinctive. It's not that Elfman became bad at his job, but at some point he started making much more typical sounding movie scores. Listen to the music in Beetlejuice or Edward Scissorhands, and there's no mistaking who wrote it. You can certainly hum his Batman theme, but do you remember any of the music from Miss Peregrine? Nobody else could have written the music for Nightmare Before Christmas, but if you didn't watch the credits, would you have any idea he also wrote the music for Wanted? I mean, maybe he's just become more subtle and less bombastic. It's hard to describe exactly what's changed, but I think part of the reason certain later Tim Burton movies haven't hit people in the same way is that Burton's imagery works best when it's combined with really powerful music. And in the case of Sweeney Todd, he has Stephen Sondheim, so that's not a problem here. I know plenty of musical theater people who were upset by this movie because of the changes that were made to Sondheim's score, but actually one of the things I think is so impressive about this movie is what a perfect example it is of how to do an adaptation. When you're adapting something from one medium to another, you have to understand the differences between the mediums. When you're making a movie of a stage play, you can't just film the play. Things won't land the same way. Things that make sense on stage will be awkward in a film. I think that with the movie, Burton made really deft decisions about what would and wouldn't work from the play and the best ways to find cinematic equivalents for things that needed to be changed. And I'm not going to go into all the details here because you can argue through change by change, which people have done because Sondheim fans are rightly very passionate about his work. But in the end, Sondheim was involved in the movie himself. He was there for the recording sessions, and he understood and approved all of these changes.
Almost every musical that's been adapted from a stage play is a version of the stage play, and it's just in front of a camera. And the nice thing about Sweeney Todd is that Tim Burton is transforming a stage piece into a movie. It's a real movie. I think it's the first time it's really been done.
I think, he's the living master of the American musical theater. This is his masterpiece. It's his most important work. And we could not have done it without working closely and without feeling that he blessed all of the decisions made. And he was remarkably collaborative and open to ways to make it not just a stage musical, but a movie. And I think delighted in the process of reinventing it. Could not have been a better collaborator.
What the fans of the stage musical are going to find is a lot of cuts, both within the songs and songs that have been cut. And I'm going to try to urge them as much as possible to leave their memory of the stage show outside the door because, as I say, unlike all other movies of musicals that I know, this really is movies of stage musicals. This really is an attempt to take the material of the stage musical and completely transform it into a movie. This is not a movie of the stage show. This is a movie based on a stage show.
He actually said that he really liked this version because it was amazing for him to hear his music played with a full orchestra, whereas on stage they usually had to perform it with less instruments. People complain too about Burton casting actors here who aren't professional singers, or about him having the actors sing their own parts and not having the singing parts dubbed in, but I think that was a smart decision also. You want the actors to sound like themselves when they're singing. It would be too jarring for them to suddenly sound completely different once they start singing, and he wanted to cast the actors he wanted to see act the parts, not cast them just for their voices. It's also a different type of singing in a movie where the camera is tight on an actor's face, as opposed to on stage where they have to belt things out for people in the audience. Not that singing can't be subtle on stage, but again, it's just a different kind of performance than in a movie.
Seems a downright shame. 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 Seems a downright shame.
He said, because you're singing and you're already in a big environment, you're singing, there's a full orchestra, you look strange because we've got rather dramatic makeup. You've got to counteract that with a very restrained performance.
And like he did with the music, Sondheim also approved the casting decisions here with actors, and he was there in the studio with them when they recorded their parts. So for all those reasons, I have no problem with how the music here is different than on stage. I'm judging this as a movie, not as I would judge a stage production of Sweeney Todd. And as a movie, I think it's great. Like with Sleepy Hollow, I think Burton benefits here from an R rating, allowing him to let the blood fly. And in spite of the grim or even sometimes disgusting events in the story, I think this is also one of his most beautiful movies. The gore here is all poetic and painterly and abstract. It's about love and obsession and about the twisted souls of the characters, not about literal serial killers, and I think it reaches some of the highest operatic heights of Burton's filmography. It might be controversial to include Nightmare Before Christmas on this list at all, since some people will argue that it shouldn't be, since it technically wasn't directed by Burton, but I consider this to be a Tim Burton movie as much or more than any other movie on this list. I know Henry Selick seems to be bitter at times that he doesn't always get full credit as being the director of this, but there's a reason that it's officially billed as Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Everybody knows this is a Tim Burton movie the same way everybody knows Return of the Jedi is a George Lucas movie. The reason Burton didn't take the director credit on this movie himself is that stop-motion movies can take years to film, and at the time he had other projects and time-sensitive things that he needed to do, like Batman Returns, so he couldn't be on the set every day for that length of time. But this entire project from the ground up originated from and was guided by him. He actually probably did more here than on several other projects where he's the credited director, because here the idea started with him, he wrote the book on which it's based, all the designs are his designs, and on and on. There are a lot of other projects where he came in well after they were underway, and his contribution as a director was actually much less involved. The whole concept here is based on Burton's childhood experiences watching TV holiday specials. The reason he got Selleck to direct it is because it was Burton's idea to make the movie in stop motion, and so he needed somebody with experience in that area. Since this movie was made with stop motion models, everything you see on screen had to be built. There were no props they could just go and buy, and so every single little thing you see in the movie is either based on a Tim Burton design directly or on somebody trying to make something in Tim Burton's style. Even a little tiny thing like the duck toy that's one of the Christmas presents appeared first in Burton's Hansel and Gretel short. The spiral hill from Nightmare Before Christmas was also in Hansel and Gretel. The trees in the woods in Nightmare are how Burton designed the trees in Hansel and Gretel, and so on. So if you don't consider this a Tim Burton movie, then it's one of the most slavish attempts to copy somebody else's work that's ever been done. But it's okay that it's all in Tim Burton's style, because ultimately it is a Tim Burton movie. No insult to Henry Selick, who did a great job and made a lot of contributions, just like many other contributors on all of Tim Burton's movies have done. But the question of authorship here has a clear answer. It's a Tim Burton movie, and it's one of Tim Burton's best movies. Everything here is just so beautifully crafted and designed. It's like being inside of a sculpture. I still remember vividly the first time I saw this movie as a kid, and it just blew my mind. I ended up building a whole little model Halloween town in my bedroom and making plasticine models of the characters, trying to figure out how the stop motion was done. I got the behind the scenes book that came out, and I read it over and over. It was one of the first things for me that was like a little film class. And when I've rewatched the movie as an adult, I've been equally impressed. It's not just that the designs are great, it's extraordinary filmmaking in other ways too. The scene I always come back to is when Sally escapes to go give Jack the gift basket she's made for him. The scene works on a symbolic level, with Sally tearing herself apart in her escape and then sewing herself back together, and it also works on an emotional level and a story level, perfectly showing you their relationship in this very short amount of time. Sally hero worships him and loves him, but it's not just some kind of blind adoration because he's the king of Halloween Town. She also feels pity for him because she understands he's unhappy. At the same time, he's been kind of oblivious to her, but not in a mean or narcissistic way. He just hasn't had a reason yet to know much about her, but he's warm and kind when she brings him a present, even if he's a little bit confused as to why she's doing that. It's a much more subtle and complicated kind of love story than you would normally find in a cartoon, but what makes it even more impressive here is that the scene does all this without any dialogue. It's purely communicated by the editing and by the characters' expressions and actions and their body language, like a silent movie. Communicating complex ideas like this without any words is difficult for any filmmaker, even with great actors, but then when you stop to consider this movie was doing all of that with little 10-inch puppets, it becomes really something amazing and impressive.
This is one of my favorite films because it's one of my more personal ones, and if you want to know what it's like growing up in Burbank, then watch Edward Scissorhands.
I kind of wondered if some people might be confused by me ranking Edward Scissorhands higher here than Nightmare Before Christmas, when in my Christmas movies video I rank Nightmare higher than Edward Scissorhands. But that video is ranking how well things work as Christmas movies, and this video is ranking things as Tim Burton movies, and this might just be the most Tim Burton movie that Tim Burton ever made. If there's a problem with Edward Scissorhands and Burton's filmography, it might be that he almost shot his whole wad here, because everything he likes to talk about, every theme he's been obsessed with, all of it is expressed here, and everything he's ever made is a variation on something that you could already find in this movie in some way. That's not saying that he's limited as a filmmaker or didn't have any other ideas that were worth making. It's just that this movie is kind of a crystalline distillation of everything that he's about. You have the Frankenstein story, of course, and the mad scientist, and you have that done in the fairy tale mode he also likes. And you have the pale, black-haired Burton stand-in, you have the themes of art and isolation, you have suburban Burbank where he grew up, and the mean, small-minded villagers that don't understand the artist. You have Danny Elfman's music, you have Johnny Depp and Winona Ryder. It's just kind of all here in one perfect little package, and it has all the qualities of his best work. It's funny and it's sad, it's emotionally engaging, it's beautiful to look at. Everything has the handmade look of his best work. Everything feels like you're inside of a painting. Even a simple set like the room where they open the movie with Winona Ryder telling the story to her granddaughter looks like it was hand painted and made out of paper mache. It almost looks like they're inside of a dollhouse. None of that is an affectation or just a superficial stylistic indulgence, because it's all purposefully fitting the fairy tale tone of the story story here. It's actually necessary to make the concept of the movie work, because if it didn't have that tone, it wouldn't work at all if you were taking it more literally. The Frankenstein story and the suburban setting are all used in service of a little fable that expresses a theme that Burton's returned to constantly of his discomfort in a society that wants to categorize people and tell them how to be, but telling it through those devices makes the message whimsical and light rather than hectoring. You can see the theme in the way Burton casts the movie. Before that, in his movies, Winona Ryder had been the dark-haired, outcast goth girl, so here he casts her as the blonde cheerleader. Anthony Michael Hall at that point was probably best known for being the meek little nerd in The Breakfast Club, so here Burton casts him as the aggressive jock. It's all a fantasy and meant to subtly play with expectations, and the whole thing actually works beautifully. While I don't think Burton's recent movies have all been bad, I have wished that he'd make more personal and original movies rather than franchises and remakes. And when you think of what an original Burton story would be like, you immediately think of him making something like Edward Scissorhands. But the problem is that what makes this movie great is that it's a one-off. You wouldn't want him to do the same thing, and it couldn't get made today even if they tried. Like most of Burton's best movies, that's what makes them great. I hope that now that he says he's been reinvigorated in making movies with Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, that he's got more things like this in him that'll come out in the future.
Mm-hmm.